Welcome to Voices of Privacy. Today, it is our pleasure to host a privacy talk with Sandy Bass, Digital Creative Content Manager at ABC Studios. Sandy is also a Virginia Tech alum, and it's our privilege to have him today. Welcome, Sandy.
Thank you so much for having me, Donna. It's a pleasure.
So we're going to dive right into it, Sandy, and talk about entertainment, the industry that you have been a part of for so long. And obviously it has changed so much. If you could share the approach of what film studios used to do in the past to market to consumers for traditional movies or TV, how did they get the word out years ago? And what are the biggest challenges and changes you've seen in the last 5 or 10 years?
I would say that overall, it's just how content's digested as well as how it's actually presented and gotten to the delivered to the actual world. And just think about like how even just a few decades ago, how there would be different channels and you would be limited to just what was on cable television. And really commercials were a primary way of like relaying and promoting other shows as well as like other content that was out there. There was no YouTube, there was no searchability, there was no Google. So really relying on just like radio as well as like live broadcasts as your means of promoting other entertainment. And that has just changed so tremendously with the invention of the internet and the use of that, as well as like how people connect with social media and different platforms in that regard. And then how there are so many different channels of content now. There are channels on YouTube, there's streaming services, there's movies, there's TV, and it can be in sometimes overwhelming. So how people actually select what their type of content there is of their interest is one layer, but then in addition to that, to find other types of content and actually how to promote that and how to break through the chatter and the cluster of all the overwhelming information has been a challenge for marketing across the board, but it's also an exciting endeavor too. And that's what I love about my job is that we really get to figure out how to develop that strategy to reach out to people, as well as what type of content to create to speak to your respective audiences, as well as what's going to break through the clutter and all the noise that's happening. And also what are the appropriate channels to really fit that audience, as well as that niche that you're trying to reach out to and promote it to those general audiences of interest.
There was so much packed in there, and it was so good because it was honestly what has been done in the past. And we had a conversation recently about those 3 channels, ABC, CBS, NBC, and the ability to reach that consumer, right, with the right message at the right time. Now, as you've discussed, media fragmentation and the immense, and it's not just it's media fragmentation from the social perspective, from the streaming perspective. It's how to really direct consumers. How do you think within the fragmentation, you talked a little bit about content, but really data, consumers' data, and trying to understand and track and profile so you're getting the right message to the right audience at the right time? Is there any formula, recipe, anything you've seen that has worked?
It's the answer that no one likes, and it just depends on the situation as well as the audience member, but it's so true. And I think that's what makes our job so exciting as marketers, is always like changing things and throwing sometimes spaghetti against the wall and seeing what sticks and what doesn't. And I think there's a lot of great tools that are available to actually get those insights, as well as like previous behavior. If there's comp titles and comp movies that have similar interests or similar crossovers between those respective audiences, that's a good gauge of like they may be interested in your particular title or your specific brand based on their behavior in the past. But sometimes it doesn't indicate that. So again, you just have to really just plug and play and just try different things and be flexible. And I think that that's what makes reporting and analytics so important too, is really understanding that sometimes you're going to have successes with what's worked in the past, but times are always changing, as well as your audiences are always evolving and changing too. What you watch on Netflix this week may be completely different what you watch on Hulu next year.
Thank you. That's great information. As you talked, kept thinking that it seems that, of course, consumer data and the profiling information that is derived from that is very necessary in your industry and in what you do. My question is whether people should be concerned about their data privacy and their information privacy.
I feel like it is like like as you're seeing more and more stories break, I feel like about just like information sharing and people not knowing and having giving permission or consent for their information to be taken, especially on different platforms that they may visit just once or twice, not knowing that in order to gain access to those channels, they have to give up some information. And by just like clicking an accept button, they don't realize what that means and what that actually leads to. So for people that are not as familiar with technology as well as what they're buying into, especially older audiences that may not read the fine print and just my grandmother's a perfect example. When she logs into Facebook, like she likes to do these apps and different games. And then when she like essentially agrees to the terms and conditions, she doesn't know that she's releasing all this information in order to buy into that too. So really just understanding that it depends on the scenario and when people are, and as well as like companies are obtaining that information, also how they're doing it. But in addition to that, it's just like the knowledge of the user too, and whether or not they're comprehending that they're actually releasing this information at their own will or consent, whether or not it's in the fine print or not. And I would just say, in addition to that, it's beneficial for us in the industry that like when we do actually obtain this information, it helps us with tracking as well as developing a strategy and campaigns that are fit more for audiences of interest. We want to make sure that we're not crossing any boundaries and abandoning any trust, especially for our loyal audiences as well.
Thank you. Glad to hear about the ethical view of the industry. In last question, could you talk maybe a little bit about what you see as the future of consumer targeting in your industry? What's next in terms of how you're going to do your job, and are there any implications for privacy?
That is a really great question. I just feel like it's going to be even more fragmented. There's going to be even more noise, and it's just going to be harder and harder to break through the clutter. And I think there's going to be a lot of practices that we implement that are very similar to what we do now, but it's going to constantly evolve. I think in order to continue to obtain information, as well as really understand the behavior of users and audiences across the board, we'll need to develop more and more practices in terms of like how to reach audiences. But I also think that with the future, people are becoming more aware of privacy as well as like what it means to buy into things. So I think those safeguards will be starting to be implemented with time too. And I think the government stepping in a bit more now that they're actually more aware of what's happening too will be a big part of that. So I think there's going to be some sort of infrastructure that develops with time too, in terms of like what are the safeguards that are going to be in place for each platform? How do users give consent? What that consent looks like? When you do obtain that information, what does that look like? How it's routed? And then also who gets that information or who has access to that information? And then tying back to the general like use of that information and developing content as well as just connecting with audiences in general. How that's implemented, and is there a timestamp of like how useful, as well as like the timeline of like how long you can access that information, as well as if there's a limit to the number of people. So again, there's so many complexities with it that it's like hard to track and like understand like what the future looks like. But I think it's just going to be more and more intricate with time, and I'm interested to see how that plays out.
On behalf of Voices of Privacy, we want to thank you, Sandy Bass, for your time this morning. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.